This presentation, assessing updates within the system, comes to us from Robert Freeman, Managing Director of ACI Assurance. Robert's background includes senior level positions within organizations from both an operations and quality perspective, having served as both a plant manager and as a director of quality. He was the U.S. technical expert on the ISO 9004 2018 revision, and is also the chair of SC2 for the United States Technical Advisory Group to ISO Technical Committee 176 on quality management and quality assurance standards, including ISO 9001 and ISO 9004. Robert was also a member of Project Committee PC 302 for the auditing standard ISO 19011-2018, having served as the head of delegation for the United States for PC 302 during the final review of the standard. And with that, take it away, Robert.
Okay, thank you very much. So when we talk about assessing updates within the system, we're actually talking about the effect that a change can have and the impact or implications that an organization may experience when dealing with those changes. And in particular, the changes related to moving either from one standard to another, let's say from ISO 9001 to AS 9100, or from one version of a standard to another, let's say from ISO 45000 2018, having gone back from IS or OHSAS 18001 2007. So when those transitions occur, the most common practice is for people to think in terms of what kind of tools might I need? You know, is it checklists, or is it some type of a software or a book or things of that sort? But the truth of the matter is it actually starts a little bit more basic than that. So to kind of get you thinking through this, what we're talking about has everything to do with how an organization communicates. The management system that they have in place is a form of communication. And because it's the structure of an organization that we're talking about, if they've made sure that it's a reflection of their business, then it will definitely be a form of communication. So just like this illustration shows you on the screen, there are the three levels of communications in an organization or company. And those are upper management. In other words, the people who make things up. The area management, those who have to dish it out or make sure that it takes place. And then the other one is those who have to live with it, meaning the workforce. So the most important thing to think about is, are we setting the people up for success by the systems that we put in place? If we are, then we've effectively communicated. If not, then there's work to be done. The reason this is important from an auditor standpoint is that's what you're really trying to do. You're assessing whether or not their mechanisms for communicating and sustaining that communication, and therefore those activities, holds true over time. So what we're talking about is what would be considered a form of transitional auditing. The difference between this and what you might experience under normal audits, if you think about a third-party auditor, they're looking for what you tell them is there. If you look at a process, you're saying that process is supposed to include these characteristics or address these requirements of the standard, then that's what you're looking for. If it's a second party audit, you're looking at something similar, but you're looking at it through the eyes of the organization that's asking you to assess that vendor for their sake. So let's say it's a customer audit and they're trying to determine whether or not you can provide those goods or services to them. And then, of course, there's the internal audits where you're evaluating whether or not who you say you are is actually who you are. When we talk about transitional audit, this can be done by any one of those parties. But the idea behind the transitional audit is you're evaluating the transition from one standard or iteration of a standard to another with the focus on management system performance. If you don't focus on management system performance, you can say, yes, they now look like that other standard, but it may or may not be a reflection of whether or not they actually are effective in the approach that they employ. So to help you kind of work through this, I've broken this down into three different stages. And the first one is this stage one known as the truth. So just like it says in the slide, understanding what was in relation to what actually is. Okay, so meaning that most of the time what happens is someone decides they're going to institute some form of change. They make the assumption that what's there is still true. The problem is things happen within an organization that cause those changes not to hold true over time. Um, the most common place for some form of civil disobedience in the world is inside of an organization. It's not because the people that are there are attempting to be defiant. It's because they're trying to figure out how to survive. Over time, the organization changes and they provide different sense of direction to their employees or those that are working on their behalf. And when they do, they don't take into consideration what effect that change or that change in direction has on the overall system. So quite frequently, what an organization thinks exists and what who they actually are don't match. And what I mean by that is if they've got procedures or work instructions, even a manual that describes their current state of affairs, it was a snapshot in time. It was a reflection of what they thought or what they believed to be true at that moment in time. As time moves forward, they're then faced with the reality of changes that have occurred. The question is, how effectively have they managed those changes? And have those changes really been captured in the structure that exists? So before you think in terms of transitioning from one standard to another or from one iteration of a standard, again, from 9001 to 9100, for example, or from 9001 to 13485, you need to think about making sure that who they really are is known. So that's why we've identified this potential challenge, identifying the point of reference used for each process or activity in relation to the requirements being fulfilled. And this requires a firm grasp of the relationship between definition, which would be things like procedures, work instructions, checklists, manuals, things like that, competence, in other words, what somebody has to be able to do in order to fulfill the requirements, including survive the experience of those requirements, and control. Controls being could be inspections or tests. It could be alarms, bells, whistles, things of that sort. So I'm going to give you a little bit more detail behind those three things because it's important to note or understand how those things are applied so that you can evaluate whether or not the activity or process that's being performed or the series of events, process based auditing, are a reflection of those systems. So when we talk about definition, you're going to review the management system documents to understand how they're used and whether they match how they're written. Okay, so when you think about the way people write documents, most commonly the opportunity is to sit down, or the circumstances to sit down and try and think through the series of events and capture any and all details needed to support that series of events. The question that really should come into play is not what details need to be in the document, but more importantly, how will it be used? The application is more critical than the details because until you understand how it will be applied, then those details may or may not be pertinent. I mean, you could create a document that's 30 pages long, that's exhaustive in terms of how it addresses all of the components associated with a process. But then will the people who have to use it be able to use it? Either because it's a reflection of the language or the way that they receive communication. It's the way that they operate. It includes the way that you would have to function as a business, meaning that if you've got a process that has to be is in a constant state of motion, is there really time for people to stop and read those documents? What tends to happen more frequently than not is that the organization sets things up and then trains people to follow those series of events. The question then becomes, do the documents support that method? So it's kind of like understanding the difference between documents that are written so that people follow them, like a checklist, um, a procedure or a work instruction that they have to follow, where it's providing the step-by-step series of events that are truly a reflection of the way they operate, versus you train someone to those documents, and after they're trained to them, they simply fulfill those tasks over and over again and understand the dynamics of what changes or what may occur that would require them to have variation in their process. So if you understand that, you begin to understand that it's now, are you training them to understand how to read a document, or are you training them to the document? If you're training them to understand how they read the document, then In a moment, when we talk about competence, you'll begin to see that that competence is relative to their ability to use that information. Okay. Whether that ability is because it's in their language, it's got proper illustrations to cope with maybe changes or adaptations associated with languages, um, or it's set up so that they can actually see it in line with what's happening, which could be a computer-based system, or again, it could be just something that's a paper copy that's available to them. If that's the approach used, then again, the relationship to competence is someone's ability to use that information. If that relationship is actually more geared towards it's what a trainer would use to make sure they've covered everything, then it's written a different way. It's written more towards the bullet items or the key points that a trainer has to make sure that the trainee gets along the way. And the idea being that the trainer is able to then convey those pieces of information and account for those instances where things may have some degree of variation in them, and then not release the employee until that takes place. So, in order for that to work, the documents have to be a reflection of those processes and the way that they operate. Okay? So, just as it says at the bottom of the slide, potential challenge, documents tend to be written as if if they will be utilized and followed day in and day out, but most are rarely referred to once in place. The issue is not how much they say about a process, but whether or not they truly are followed or can/will provide the foundation of competence. Okay, meaning they're going to be used between a trainer and a trainee. So it's important to understand how documents are used to determine whether or not the methods will support any transition that may take place. Otherwise, all that happens is it's time to move from one standard to another. So all we did was change a few words to speak. Like take for instance, we changed the words to no longer speak in terms of some type of an industrial application to some type of a medical device application because we're moving from 9001 to 13485. If that's the case, then you want to make sure that it's more than just that the documents are a reflection of what really happens so that they can support either use or training, depending on how they're applied. I've been talking quite a bit about competence in relation to this. And again, one aspect of competence, remember the idea isn't just that they've trained people to things, it's that they know what they're doing. They're capable, they have the capabilities to actually accomplish the task. So if we're talking, because I want you to think of this relationally, if we're talking about those documents, we're talking about the documents in relation to either someone being competent or capable of reading them and using them, or they're capable of being able to be trained to them or applying the information from them. Okay, so in that frame, the idea is it's important to understand how the organization applies training. Why would this be pertinent or why would this be critical when you're doing an assessment from a transition standpoint? Because if you don't understand that, you won't know whether or not the use of the documents they have in place are effective, first and foremost. And secondly, when you're defining competence for the next round or to deal with the next version or iteration of a standard, you'll simply do the same thing you did with a document, convert the information over. Okay, so in this case, you might convert a training matrix or a job description to simply say, yep, it satisfies 13485 or it satisfies AS 9100. When the truth of the matter is, the organization is really looking for you as an auditor to help them understand whether or not they're doing things effectively, not simply appeasing a given standard. One of the biggest challenges when it comes to competence, and when you think about this relationship between competence and definition, which would be the documents we were just talking about, and then the possibility of that same thing coming in play with regard to the controls that are in place, which we'll talk about in just a moment. The biggest challenge that organizations face with these transitions is whether or not they understand competence to the fullest extent. Let's take, for example, an organization that is simply providing a service that the service involves cleaning. Okay, so they're helping an organization clean their facility, and it could be a clean room type environment. Let's say that in there you relied heavily on the labels on a piece of equipment, or you relied on the labels that are actually on the containers that are used for cleaning to give you an indication of what they can or cannot use to clean specific surfaces. Okay? So then one of the things that the organization did, because they had to have a little bit more control in support of, let's say, a medical device type situation, is that they put in play color coding. Now, the important thing is to understand whether or not the employees or the workers who are involved can actually see those colors. Meaning, whether or not somebody is colorblind now becomes a piece of competence. It may not have been a factor or a variable to account for in the previous version, but now because they've transitioned, there are some additional components associated with competence that may need to come into play. An organization that may have been ISO 9001 registered, that had people that were providing welding services for them, and they did it based on qualifying those people themselves. They then reach a point where now they have to receive or utilize certified welders. When that comes into play, you now get into situations where it's not just the welder's ability to pass a test, but there's also a test associated with the welder's ability to see. And that test also has to be passed. So now you get into a piece of the puzzle that sometimes is defined for you. In other cases, you need to make sure you're thinking through it. So that type of competence, when you're thinking about differences in standards and the way that they're applied, if you were previously 14,001 registered and you decided you now wanted to integrate a management system with a quality management requirements in it as well, so 9,001, you move from basic calibration to a much more adept or complete version of calibration. And now it comes into someone's ability to not only select the correct piece of equipment and make sure that it is in calibration, but whether or not they know what that variation needs to be associated with that piece of equipment, or possibly having to actually perform the calibrations or verifications themselves. So, the main thing is to recognize, just like it says in this potential challenge, these programs tend to focus on training personnel to processes with the belief that that's what competence is. Okay, I trained you to this task, therefore you're complete. But it's important to recognize that it's possible that they could have other details associated with it. And that is the relationship of processes or these attributes, which could include physical attributes, being a factor or a consideration that needs to be accounted for. Now, the third piece to this puzzle, so again, this is a three-piece puzzle that deals with definition, competence, and control. So it's not, most of the time, when we assess these things, we think in terms of them one at a time. I'm going to go do an assessment of processes. So I'm basically doing a review of how those processes have been provided for, or how they're managed or controlled. So that may be one piece of the puzzle, but there's a relationship between that and the type of competence that someone needs, as well as the controls that may be in place or may need to be in place. Controls, as I said before, can be things like alarms, bells, whistles, inspections, or tests. But it can also be systems that will prevent you from doing something wrong or highlight the fact that you've done something wrong. You're doing data entry for an organization, and as a result of it, when you put in the data and hit the button to accept all of the information, the system scans through it, and if it's got something in a field that's inappropriate, it flags it and brings it back up to you and tells you it can't move forward. So that's got to be resolved. So from that standpoint, in some cases, the controls prevent errors. In other cases, the controls catch errors, and that information can still be used if it's applied correctly through some form of data analysis to resolve those things. But in the end, that control still needs to be seen in relation to someone's ability to use it. Okay. If somebody doesn't understand what that screen means, they could simply keep typing in details until it accepted it, whether or not it was the right information or not. So it's important for people to understand how those flags work. Okay. It's also important to understand how they apply the information. When someone shows up to do something, is that control an end result that needs to be assessed as such, or is it a step in the process? An example of this was I was working with a company many years ago and doing an assessment of their organization, and they had a an inspection step in their process. In this particular case, the inspection step was to determine if further processing was needed instead of whether or not the product met acceptance criteria. So when they dealt with that particular step, they had to understand that it was not non-conforming product. It was simply in need of additional work to achieve conformance. Okay, a little bit off the beaten path for many auditors because they look at it and say, "Oh my goodness, no, that's non-conforming product." Depends on the process. So it's important to understand those things as controls, and then how are they applied, and what does that output not only do on its own, but what arises from it. So main thing to remember as we kind of work through this, so let me finish this off as it relates to control. The potential challenge, controls tend to be seen as stopgaps instead of error prevention. Even in systems that are intended to identify issues, can aid in error prevention, meaning if the organization uses the data from that to identify areas where they should focus their efforts on improvement and therefore eliminate or greatly reduce that thing, then it is a form of error prevention. So as much as we would like to think of error prevention being preemptive, it can also be post-mortem, meaning that if the system is there, it shouldn't be completely post-mortem, but it is possible that you're using that information to advance or enhance those systems or those capabilities. Okay. Additionally, the application of these controls may or may not be seen in relation to the management system documents or competence, and they need to be. Someone's ability to use that system. So you may move from a number of people that are completing a task to a robot or an AI type system that's functioning. Someone still has to be able to use it, including their ability to read any information that it's providing, load information into it, and then support it to the extent that it's still producing the same types of results that it would have been needed if it was a person sitting there. So again, you want to look at the relationship between competence definition and control. So as I said before, I've given you some perspective on definition, documents like procedures, checklists, things of that sort. Competence, what someone is able to do because they have the skill set or the attributes associated with completing that. And then control, things that prevent people from doing something wrong or confirm that it's been done correctly. The relationship of those things need to be understood from an audit perspective, because it's really about seeing through the eyes of the organization how they've applied those things in their management system. So management systems of yesterday thought in terms of they documented everything. So you had this manual that had to exist, and then these procedures, which were then supported by work instructions and checklists or forms that could be converted into records and so on. In some cases, those still exist, but in many cases, with a result arising from 9001 being more of an open platform, meaning the standard allows you to apply it in a broad range of ways. Same thing with 14,001 and even 45,001, as well as many other standards. Because of that, it's important for the auditor to understand the relationship between what an organization has defined, in other words, their documentation, what they've accounted for through competence, and how that fits in relation to controls. Now, it doesn't mean that those three things, definition, competence, and control, are in that order. It depends on the organization. And in many cases, it actually depends on that specific process or activity, meaning the organization could have more than one way that they've approached something. For one process, it's got a document or like a procedure in place, and then they train people to that procedure. And after they're finished, there's someone that inspects or checks their work. That would be the more traditional type of an approach. But you could have some where someone has been hired in because of their competence, and it's very competence oriented, meaning there's very little documentation to support it because the documentation is based on the competence, not the activities. Okay. The other alternative is very control based. You've made it so that people can't do something wrong. They have to do it correctly. So that starting point for each of those scenarios or circumstances needs to be considered as you relate to each process that's in place. Without doing so, you can either impose things on an organization or simply gloss over the fact that they have something and believe that it was effective. And if you're going to transition and it's going to be an effective transition, and it doesn't include things that are not applicable or not pertinent anymore, as well as making sure that it covers those things that are, it's important to recognize how they've applied what they have in place and whether or not it's a true reflection of the organization before you simply move forward and start plugging and playing with a new version or iteration of a standard. So, in order to do this, I'm going to take you to stage 2, which is now what I'm going to refer to as a comparative analysis. Right? So in this comparative analysis, now you understand who they are and have a full grasp of it being true, meaning you've got a true point of reference to work from, to how does what they want to get to match up? Where are the differences that may exist? So as an auditor, you're assessing this, and it could be assessed because as a third party, you are doing a review to determine whether or not that organization is ready to move to that standard. If you're a second party, you're trying to figure out whether or not your organization, such as the customer that you represent or are, your needs are going to be met when these changes take place. There have been situations where a company said, we're going to go to AS 9100, and when they do, the company that they are selling to is concerned because they're not an aerospace company. So they want to know that it still covers everything that they need. And so that would be another reason to do a comparative analysis. So just like it says in here, evaluate who they are versus who they will need to become. Okay, that's the focal point. It's who they were, and that's why we wanted to do that first part. Is it true to who they need to become in order to accomplish this? So in order to do that, there are some resources that are available. Of those resources, think in terms of it could be relative to transitioning one standard to another. Reviewing the foreword and introduction can be helpful when you're looking at those documents. Additionally, many standards also include annexes, or you can find them through the resources available to those standards. And you can also use other tools to bridge that gap. You might look at a book of some sort, or someone may have developed some type of a matrix to take into account. But the idea is you're trying to make sure that the organization grasps the difference between one to the next. As an auditor, not because you're trying to coach them down that path, but you're trying to reach a conclusion. You're this close or this far away from something. How the organization chooses to resolve it is up to them. Okay, even if you're doing it from an internal audit standpoint, because it's too easy for you to step in and say, here, just fix it like this. The most critical reason for not doing that is many times you can fix one thing and break something else because you're only looking at it through the eyes of that situation or circumstance versus looking at it through the eyes of the entire management system as a whole. So just as I explained some of the examples that you can use or things that you can see that will support this, you can see I'm using as an example ISO 9001:2015. So when that transition came out, a couple of things that exist inside the foreword of the standard are, it tells you first and foremost, and this isn't necessarily in the order that it's in there, but in the example I'm giving you, it makes mention of the fact that there's a matrix that you can have access to that gives you an idea of the difference between 9001:2008 and 9001:2015. Additionally, ISO TS 9002:2016 was developed, and it is guidelines for the application of ISO 9001:2015. So when 2015 came out, because this version of an ISO 9001 was quite a bit different than the 2000/2008 version of the standard, it was believed that it would be wise by the committee, SE2 for TC 176, to provide a guidance document to support the application of the standard. So ISO TS 9002:2016 was developed by members of the group that developed ISO 9001:2015. And just like it says there, it provides guidance on the intent of the requirements in ISO 9001:2015 with examples of possible steps. The important thing to remember It says possible steps, okay? Because it's critical to recognize that 9002 is a guidance document. It's not a requirements document. It's not an interpretation document. It's simply a way to look at 9001. So just as it says there, with examples of possible steps an organization can take to meet the requirements. It does not add to, subtract to, from, or in any way modify the requirements, okay? And it doesn't prescribe mandatory approaches to implementation. So remember that it can be taken into consideration, but 9002 is not a document that is intended to be used during an audit to identify whether an organization is conforming or not conforming to 9001-2015. It's simply a guidance document that can be used to support the implementation. So in that way, when an organization is transitioning, it can be used from that standpoint to understand those things. And if you're an auditor, it helps to understand, not so that you can impose something on an organization, but you get a better feel for why they may have applied the requirements in 9001-2015 a specific way. So, potential challenge, as it says, although there are many resources describing opinions or educated guesses about what is said or what needs to be accomplished or achieved, what is presented by the organization needs to be based or assessed on its own merits. Okay? Meaning, when an organization applies any one of these standards, as an auditor, it's not that you look at the opinions of others, you assess the merit of what's there first and foremost. That's what you're trying to do, is can I get to recognizing whether or not 9001 in this particular example, okay, because this could be ISO 14001, it could be ISO 45001, ISO 22000, it could be any of those standards, that when you're looking at it, you're saying, what did the organization do? Because it's, when you read through those standards, what you end up finding out is the standard says the organization shall, okay, meaning they are the ones that figure out how they apply the standard. You then determine whether or not their application of the standard is adequate, whether it's effective in the approach that they've employed. Okay, so a way to evaluate this comparative analysis is a table similar to the one that I've given here on this page. So if you look, I have categories there for what the previous standard said. So it's got previous clause, what was required, the new clause, because it may not be the same numbering sequence between standards, what is required, what is currently in place, and then what is lacking. So if you were doing a comparative or a transitional analysis, this is really what you would be looking for or looking to understand in an organization. So let's take, for an example, the first one I have listed there. Previous clause, none, because 4.1 in the new standard, so 9001 as the example we're working with, did not include anything about monitoring and reviewing internal information about external and internal issues, meaning that 9001-2008 did not have that requirement in it. So as a result of it, there is no previous clause to look at to evaluate or assess against. So that's why it then says what is required: monitor and review information about external and internal issues. Okay? So that's what it's included in 4.1 of ISO 9001-2015. What is currently in place, it's not yet addressed. Okay, so what is lacking? Determination of relevant external and internal issues, including how they will be monitored and reviewed. Okay? So it's just a reiteration of what the standard's asking for, because there is no comparison that can be done against it. If you look at the next line, again, using ISO 9001-2008 and ISO 9001-2015. So 9001-2008 in 6.4 said, determine and manage work environment needed to achieve conformity to product requirements. That requirement in ISO 9001-2015, 7.4, is very similar, but it does have some minor adjustments to what's there. And because if you look, it says determine, provide, and maintain, whereas before in 9001-2008, it said determine and manage. Okay, and then it also said in there needed to achieve conformity to product requirements, whereas in 2015's version of 9001, it says necessary for the operation of processes and to achieve conformity of products and services. So in this particular analysis, you can see what's currently in place. It was a review of a planning process that included methods for determining, providing for, and maintaining the work environment. Meaning it was seen, just like it says under what is lacking, it was seen as being accounted for as the approach employed to manage, meaning the way that they described manage in the previous version, in other words, what existed in their system, included provisions for maintaining of resources. So in this particular case, it's basically saying that while the standard moved from point A to point B, meaning it was 6.4, now it's 7.4, and while before it was determine and manage, now it's determine, provide, and maintain, that determine and manage, by the way it was applied in what the organization already had, supported the same activities, meaning their version of manage was to provide and maintain. And their method of maintaining and providing also accounted for the processes as well as achieving conformity to the products. Okay? So potential benefit by doing something like this is, while you as the auditor are identifying gaps and noting where you believe the current approach addresses the newer version of a standard, the organization will be able to get a feel for where they are compliant and where they need to focus their resources. It's just a big challenge when it comes to these transitions, because you can get lost in the minutia, mainly because none of the standards are written as if they were a series of events. They are written to address a set of requirements. Okay. What I mean by that is you may or may not apply it in a 4.1, 4.2, and so on approach. The application tends to be a moving around within the standard, utilizing a series of requirements based on how a particular process is set up. Okay, so it's important to grasp the concept of those things. Okay, so now let's talk about stage 3 of this, or what we would refer to as the conclusion. Okay, so organizations sometimes struggle to see the relationship between their management system and their business systems, meaning that they create a manual for safety. And when they create the manual for safety, they finish writing it out, they get an auditor to look at it, and then they put it on a shelf and it collects dust. Okay. That means it's not truly a reflection of their business systems, versus it's integrated in. It's an action that has a direct relationship to the way that they function as an organization. And as a result of that, it is part of the way they live things instead of something that they have to survive. Okay? So just like it says here, between their systems, the approach used to perform this assessment needs to think and speak in business terms and norms. One of the things I find to be the most significant challenge for auditors is how often they reach a point where they don't think about things through the way the business functions. Okay, they try to appease the standard, and they try to make the organization appease the standard, even to the extent that where they're telling an auditor, or not an auditor, but the organization's management, what do they have to do to make sure that they've satisfied the standard. And so the organization tends to think of it more in terms of a test instead of a way of life. So anytime you can shift that by the way that you perform the audit and by the way that you communicate the information that you're working your way through, the better it'll be. Okay. And what I mean by that is your overall goal: help the organization function effectively. Okay. Remember the word effectively, with the aid of a well-established and maintained management system, because this means that they are prepared and positioned to achieve sustained success. Okay? Notice that it doesn't say down there to achieve registration. It achieves sustained success, because if the more it's a reflection of the business, the more that they will actually do and live those activities, and it'll become a part of the way of life instead of something they have to turn on or turn off because it's time for that audit. Okay. So if you have any additional questions or need any additional assistance, here's my card. So on the front side there, there's my particular details, and then for ACI as a whole. So thank you for the opportunity, and I hope that you found the information beneficial.
Well, thank you, Robert Freeman, for an exceptional overview of the tools auditors need to identify gaps from one version of a standard to the next. And that concludes this presentation.